Part 1. When the World Fell Apart. Janine was 56 when she traded comfort for custody. Everyone said she was crazy, but she didn't care. Because love doesn't walk away when it gets hard. It leans in. Janine never planned to raise a child again. Not at her age. Not after finally making it through the exhausting climb of motherhood, the messy years of marriage, the sacrifices, the survival. She had built something decent. Nothing flashy, but safe. A modest 3-bedroom home with a front porch and a sliver of garden. A steady remote contract job in HR. She worked from home, and she was exceptional at what she did. Organized, empathetic, strategic. She had spent years building a reputation for solving difficult employee conflicts and creating systems that actually worked. She was well respected and well paid. She carried more than her share of the household expenses. Her husband, Rich, had one foot in retirement. He called it consulting, but Janine knew better. He took the occasional gig, spent the rest of his days puttering in the garage or playing golf. He hadn't helped with a bill in years, unless she asked directly, and even then, it came with a sigh. She finally had evenings to herself, weekends with friends, a good book, a cup of chamomile tea. She had earned the right to rest, but in a matter of months, that illusion cracked wide open. Her son, Derek, had always been the wild one. Bright, talented, a charmer, but easily lost in the undertow of bad choices. Janine had tried not to interfere when he married Kayla, tried not to panic when she saw the signs. But addiction doesn't wait for permission. And before long, it was everywhere. In their voices, in their missed visits, in the dark under Luca's wide eyes. Her grandson, Luca, just 4 years old, big brown eyes like his daddy's, too quiet, too careful. He clung to Janine like a raft every time she visited. She started to notice how he winced at loud noises, how he always asked if he was allowed to eat something, how he checked her face constantly, trying to read her mood. The way a child learns to survive chaos. And then the call came. Child Protective Services. Court date. Emergency custody hearing. Her husband, Rich, sat stone-faced as the judge spoke. They left the courtroom in silence. That night in the kitchen, over a cup of reheated coffee, he said it. "You're really gonna do this?" She nodded, tears already brimming. "He's our grandson." Rich looked away. "We're too old. I didn't sign up to raise another kid." 3 weeks later, he filed for divorce. It was brutal, quiet, civil, but cruel in the way that endings can be when no one is throwing plates, just walking away. Rich wanted his half of the house, wanted the equity, didn't want the burden. Janine could have fought him, but he'd have taken her for everything. Rich had a way of twisting things, making her look unreasonable while he played the victim. He knew how to work the system and had more free time than she did to spend with lawyers. And deep down, she knew he would have drained her dry just to walk away clean. He may not have raised a hand, but he knew how to leave wounds. Financial ones, emotional ones. So she did what she always did. She protected what mattered most. She let go of what she couldn't keep and held on fiercely to what she could. Luca, the house, and a quiet kind of dignity that Rich would never understand. She paid him out with nearly everything she had. Clean break, no contact. She kept the house, because Luca needed a bed he could count on, a nightlight, a place to learn what stability felt like. The days that followed were the hardest of her life. Luca had night terrors, would scream for his mother and then immediately apologize for it. Janine would rock him for hours. She learned the rhythm of preschool drop-off, peanut allergies, tiny socks that never stayed on. She held his hand as he asked questions no 4-year-old should have to ask. "Is Daddy sick? Did Mommy forget me?" And she answered with more gentleness than she knew she had. "No, sweetheart. Some grown-ups get really lost inside themselves, and they forget how to take care of others. But you didn't do anything wrong. And I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. There were sweet moments, too. Luca giggling with yogurt smeared all over his face. Saturday mornings building pillow forts. Tuesday night dance parties in the living room, just the two of them spinning barefoot to her favorite 80s songs, giggling until they collapsed onto the couch in a heap of joy. Little handwritten notes from Luca that said, "I love you, Grandma Mama," taped proudly to the fridge. The way he'd run to her after school and throw his arms around her waist like it had been years since they'd seen each other. A neighbor, Mrs. Hill, started watching him before school. Refused to take a dime. Called it my little joy of the day. Luca had that effect on people. There was something about the way he smiled, shy but full of light, that made strangers soften and neighbors linger. Mrs. Hill said seeing him wave from the porch each morning felt like a blessing. Others on the block would bend down to say hello as he passed, and every time he hugged someone, it felt like a little piece of their heart had been mended. He gave out love without effort, and somehow, that love came back to him, and to Janine, in quiet, healing ways. One Sunday afternoon, Janine and Luca spent hours finger painting on butcher paper in the garage. His tiny handprints covered the floor by the time they finished. She didn't stop him. She needed the laughter as much as he did. As the weeks turned into months, Luca began calling her Mama more and more. At first, Janine gently corrected him, but eventually, she stopped. Because he wasn't confused. He knew who she was. He just knew what she meant to him. Slowly, they built something new. Healing didn't come in grand gestures. It came in tiny, quiet moments. A full night of sleep, a day without tears, Luca asking to help her fold laundry, humming while they made grilled cheese. A little boy beginning to trust that this love wasn't going anywhere. At night, she'd fall into bed aching in every joint, not just from age, but from the emotional weight of pretending she was fine, of being the strong one, every single day. One night, after reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar for the third time, Luca rested his head on her chest and whispered, "I love you, Mama." She didn't correct him. She just held him tighter. And in that moment, she accepted it. Not just the name, but the role. She had become his mother in every way that mattered, not by birth, but by presence, by patience, by sacrifice, by love. Whatever the world saw when they looked at them didn't matter. To Luca, she was home, and for Janine, that was enough. But Janine was running on fumes. Her contract at work was set to expire. And with all the chaos, she had started looking, really looking. But there was nothing. Nothing that paid enough. Nothing flexible enough. Nothing that would let her still be the mom Luca needed her to be. She figured she'd be extended like always. She wasn't. Budget cuts. "Nothing personal," her manager said. "Just bad timing." She applied to job after job, got silence, or rejections. No one wanted to hire a 57-year-old woman with gaps in her resume and full-time childcare duties. Her savings were gone. Her energy was thinning. She pawned her jewelry, let the car go back to the bank, kept the lights on, just barely. She clipped coupons, learned to cook beans a dozen ways, wore shoes until the soles gave out, bought clothes for Luca secondhand and hemmed them at night. Every dollar had a purpose. Every decision, a weight. One night she sat at the kitchen table, Luca finally asleep, unpaid bills spread around her like shrapnel. She pressed her palms to her eyes and let out a sound she hadn't made since she was a girl, something between a sob and a prayer. How am I going to keep us afloat? What happens when there's nothing left to stretch, nothing left to sell? How do I keep being strong when I'm already running on empty? No answer. Just the hum of the fridge and the weight of the dark. But somewhere deep inside, a voice still whispered. Not loud, not clear, but steady as breath. Hold on. Trust me. You chose love. And love is never wasted. This road will grow you. It will refine you. It will stretch you beyond what you think you can bear. But I am still with you. Have faith. Persevere. Endure. It won't always feel like this, but it will be in my time, not yours. All things will be made whole again. She wiped her eyes, gathered the envelopes, and stood up. Tomorrow would come, and she would still be here for him. Part 2. Holding on by a thread. Some days, survival looks like making pancakes with the last of the eggs, like smiling through the exhaustion, like showing up when no one claps. Janine didn't feel brave. She just kept going. Janine's mornings began in the dark. Not poetic dawnlight kind of dark, the kind of dark where your bones still ache from the day before, and you lie there for just one more minute, asking God for the strength to do it all again. She'd get up quietly, brew 1 cup of coffee, and breathe into the silence before Luca woke up. Those 5 minutes belonged to her. Then the day began. She walked Luca to school every morning, hand in hand. He'd hum or point at snails or wave at the garbage truck, always watching her face to see if she was smiling. Then came the hustle, gig apps, online tutoring, helping someone's aunt file paperwork. She cobbled together what she could. The job market wasn't kind. Interviews dried up the moment she mentioned childcare. One man told her she seemed lovely, but past her prime. She didn't cry after that interview. She just closed the laptop and folded another load of laundry. Janine had always been capable, but this season demanded something else. Endurance with no applause. Hope with no guarantees. She began to understand why some people gave up. Why they stayed down when life knocked them over. Not because they were weak, but because the climb back up felt endless. Some evenings she found herself staring into the refrigerator, trying to make a meal out of pickles, oats, and 2 eggs. Other nights she'd let Luca eat cereal for dinner while they read library books under a blanket fort because the power had been shut off again. She called it a camping night. He thought it was magic. One Thursday, a recruiter called. Remote admin job, high pay, 6-month contract. But it came with a catch. 10-hour days, client-facing video calls, 0 flexibility. She could do it. She'd done harder. But Luca had only just stopped crying at drop-off. He was finally sleeping through the night, finally asking for seconds at dinner. She imagined those long days. Him waking to a babysitter, coming home to silence, falling asleep without her bedtime prayer. She pictured his face, small and unsure, trying not to ask why she was always behind a closed door. That night, she whispered to the ceiling, "Lord, is it selfish to want to provide for him and still be the one who tucks him in at night? Is it too much to ask? To give him a safe home and also be his safe place?" The offer sat in her inbox all night. She read it 3 times, rehearsed answers to questions they hadn't even asked. She turned the job down the next morning, politely, professionally. Then she cried in the bathroom for a full hour, quiet sobs that shook her shoulders and soaked her sleeves, not because she regretted the choice, but because it cost so much to make it. She didn't tell anyone, just wiped her face, made Luca lunch, and went on with her day. A week later at the grocery store, she watched a young mom fumble through her purse, red-faced, as the cashier rang up groceries. "Just these," the girl mumbled, removing milk and fruit from the belt. Janine stepped forward, quietly, so no one would be embarrassed. "I've been there. Please, let me." The girl blinked. "You don't have to." "I know. That's why I will." She covered the difference. $15. A small miracle. Not because she had plenty to spare, but because that week, by some quiet grace, she actually had enough. Enough to say yes. Enough to make someone else's load lighter, even when hers still felt heavy. That, she realized, was the miracle. The cashier, a teenager named Eric, didn't say much, but he watched her closely, like he'd seen something he couldn't quite name. He handed her the receipt with 2 hands, like it was something sacred. Janine left without thinking much of it, just glad she could give someone a break. She thought it was just a quiet gesture, but that single moment, done without fanfare, was the beginning of something much bigger than she could have imagined. That same week, Janine's blog post, a quiet corner of the internet she called the Grandma Diaries, started getting traction. Her latest entry, Choosing Love Over Easy, struck a chord. She hadn't even intended it to be profound. She just typed what she was living: exhaustion, devotion, and the sacredness of showing up. Messages poured in. I'm raising my niece. You just put my feelings into words. I thought I was the only one. Some of the messages made her cry. Not just because they were kind, but because they proved she wasn't invisible. Others made her feel less alone, like a hand had reached through the screen and said, "Me too." A few were short and simple, just 1 or 2 lines, but they echoed in her heart for hours. All of them reminded her that her story mattered, that even the hardest, most unglamorous parts of her life were resonating with people she'd never met. Her words had wandered into places she'd never go herself, offering comfort and solidarity to strangers who, like her, were just trying to hold on. She had thought she was writing to survive, but it turned out she was also writing to connect. And in doing so, God was stitching her heart back together, piece by quiet piece. One woman wrote, "Your words made me sit down and breathe for the first time all week." It wasn't money, but it was something more sacred than she expected. A thread of connection, of purpose. It was a signal flare to her weary heart. You're not alone, and this struggle isn't wasted. A reminder that maybe God wasn't swooping in to rescue her with windfalls or miracles, but He was present, threading comfort through strangers' words, stitching moments of grace between grocery trips and blog posts, weaving meaning through the waiting. And somewhere deep down she began to trust that He was building something beautiful, not in spite of her hardship, but because of it. 2 days later, her phone rang. "Hi, this is Marla. I run a nonprofit for kinship caregivers. My son Eric works at the grocery store. He told me about you." Janine almost dropped the phone. She braced herself for a scam or a survey, but Marla's voice was calm, sincere. Marla went on, "Would you like to meet? I think we might be able to help." They met at a coffee shop the next afternoon. Marla was warm, grounded, real. She wore no makeup and carried a notepad full of scribbles. She listened more than she talked. When Janine finished sharing her story, Marla just nodded. "I've heard stories like yours more times than I can count, but every single one still gets to me. Because behind each story is a heart that's been broken and rebuilt, often in silence, without praise, and without help. And when I see someone still standing in the middle of all that, I cry, because I know how much it costs to keep going." She told Janine about a local stipend program for grandparents raising children, about a monthly food partnership that delivered groceries, about access to a counselor who specialized in caregiver burnout. Janine listened, stunned. Not because she hadn't tried to find help, but because every door she'd knocked on before had been locked. But then Marla leaned forward. "I read your blog. You can write, Janine, and we need someone to tell our family's stories. Would you be interested in part-time work?" Janine stared at her, stunned. Words jammed in her throat, tangled between disbelief and fragile hope. Her hands began to shake, first subtly, then visibly, as if her body knew before her mind could catch up that something was shifting. She gripped the paper coffee cup like it might float away, grounding herself with the warmth of it. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a quiet rising sense of being seen, of being chosen. She had come to this meeting expecting information, maybe a little help, but not a lifeline, not purpose. It wasn't just a job. It was a reason. A place to pour all that pain and perseverance into purpose. She thought of the women who had messaged her, of Luca, of the version of herself she was slowly rediscovering. She said yes. That night, Luca sat in her lap while she typed. He traced her fingers across the keyboard. "You're writing about us?" he asked. "I am," she smiled. "And about all the brave people who keep showing up." He nodded solemnly. "Like you." The words came out quiet, but steady, like a truth he didn't even have to think about. Then he leaned his head against her shoulder with a little sigh, like being next to her made everything in the world feel safe again. Janine wrapped her arms around him, her heart swelling with something deeper than gratitude. She wasn't just filling in for someone. She wasn't just doing her best. In his eyes, she was enough. More than enough. She kissed his head, held him close. For a long time, they didn't say anything. Janine blinked back tears. Not from exhaustion this time, but from the soft, unfamiliar bloom of hope. A kind of hope that didn't arrive with answers or guarantees, but something quieter. Something that whispered, "Keep going. You're not alone anymore." It didn't shout or shine. It didn't solve everything. But it began to settle deep in her chest like a promise. The kind that doesn't roar in like a miracle. The kind that rises slowly, like morning light through a kitchen window. Gentle, steady, and full of grace. Sometimes, the thread we're holding on to is the very one God is weaving into something beautiful. Section 3. What you give always comes back. Some blessings don't come with fanfare. They arrive quietly, shaped like second chances, steady hands, and hearts that never gave up. Janine had planted in tears, but the harvest was coming. Janine's new part-time job didn't come with benefits or a fancy title, but it brought something better. Dignity. A sense that her voice had weight, that her story had power. For the first time in what felt like ages, she didn't just feel useful, she felt purposeful. Each week she sat down to interview grandparents, aunts, uncles, ordinary people raising the next generation after tragedy had knocked on their family's door. She listened. She wrote. She cried with them. She laughed with them. And through their stories, she stitched together healing, not just for them, but for herself. It was as if every sentence she typed unraveled a bit of her own pain and rewove it into something holy. She began to smile more, to breathe deeper. She started keeping flowers on the kitchen table again. It felt indulgent at first, spending $4.99 on daisies, but they made the house feel like hope was blooming. Luca would sit beside her sometimes, coloring at the kitchen table while she typed. Every now and then he'd ask, "Is this a story like ours?" She'd smile. "It is." Sometimes he'd draw the families she wrote about, handing her crayon stick figures and whispering, "They'll be okay." And she'd nod, because she was beginning to believe it too. Money was still tight. The stipend helped. The groceries helped. But it was the purpose that carried her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding. Slowly. Brick by brick. Word by word. One afternoon, she found an old box of family photos in the closet. She and Luca spent hours flipping through faded pictures, laughing, remembering. She told him stories about his dad when he was little, about family vacations, about the time a raccoon stole a whole pizza off their picnic table. Luca's eyes lit up with every new tale. She realized then, she was giving him not just shelter, but roots. A sense of belonging to something bigger. And then came the invitation. Marla's nonprofit was hosting its first ever community fundraiser dinner, a night to honor kinship caregivers and the work being done. Marla asked Janine if she'd be willing to speak. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't polished. She didn't like attention. But when she thought of the families who felt invisible, like she once had, she said yes. She wrote her speech over the course of a week, in the margins of her days. She kept it simple, honest. She told the story of a quiet woman who gave up her safety net, her comfort, and almost her sanity to give a little boy a second chance. She revised it at night, Luca asleep beside her on the couch, one hand still tangled in her sweater. The night of the event, she wore a thrifted dress and shoes borrowed from a friend. Luca picked out her earrings and told her she looked like a princess. Her hands trembled as she stepped up to the microphone. She took a breath,
closed her eyes for a moment, and remembered all the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, unsure if she was enough.
She looked out at a room full of people, some with tears in their eyes before she even spoke. Many of them had read her stories, seen themselves in her words.
They were parents, grandparents, and guardians who knew the weight she carried. Some had followed her journey online, sending encouragement and prayers from afar. Others were kinship caregivers themselves, weary from the same unrelenting love.
Her presence on that stage wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. Her story had cracked something open in their own hearts, and even before she uttered a word, they were already feeling the weight of it alongside her, sharing the ache, the hope, the quiet courage it took to keep going. She began. She told them about courtrooms and night terrors, about peanut-free snacks and stretching one paycheck over 30 days, about the tiny miracles, the anonymous support, the nights she wanted to give up, and the mornings she didn't. She didn't embellish. She didn't perform. She just told the truth. And when she finished, the room stood in applause. It started with a few hands clapping slowly, reverently, then spread like a wave of gratitude. Not because she'd said something fancy, not because her words were rehearsed or eloquent, but because every sentence carried weight. Truth, love, sacrifice, the kind of raw honesty that didn't need decoration. She hadn't told them what to feel. She had simply let them feel with her. And that vulnerability, that lived experience, spoke louder than any polished speech ever could. They were applauding not just her courage, but their own. Because in her story, they saw a mirror, and in her survival, they found hope for themselves. In the crowd, just past the buffet table, stood Rich. She hadn't seen him in over a year. He looked older, stiffer. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, arms crossed, her eyes unreadable. He didn't speak to her afterward, just nodded once, eyes low, then turned and left. But a donor approached her that night, a woman with silver hair and a sharp blue blazer. "You reminded me of my sister," the woman said. "She raised her granddaughter after everyone else walked away. I'd like to make a gift, in your name, a donation to help fund more storytelling work like yours, for your efforts, and for all the others like you who are out there doing the hard, holy work of love in the shadows." Janine didn't know what to say. She just nodded, hands pressed to her heart. Her eyes stung with unshed tears, the kind that come when your soul recognizes a blessing. Later, as she folded chairs and helped clean up, she felt something rise in her, something like peace. A deep breath in her spirit, a settling. It wasn't just about what she had lost anymore. It was about what had been restored. Luca's bedtime hugs, the quiet joy of purpose, the strange, sacred beauty of starting over. But even more, it was about how her willingness to stay the course had healed something deeper, not just in herself, but in Luca and in the people who had followed her journey. Luca was no longer the anxious, unsure little boy who used to wake crying for his parents. He had grown steady, grounded, full of light. His laughter came easier now, and his trust came deeper. He called her Mama like it had always been true, because in his heart, it was. And the readers, those who had seen themselves in her stories, began to write back with stories of their own. One woman said reading Janine's words gave her the courage to step in and raise her niece. A grandfather wrote to say he finally felt seen. Letters poured in, sometimes just a sentence or two, but always filled with gratitude. What Janine had lived and shared was creating a ripple, one that softened hearts, strengthened resolve, and helped restore hope. She hadn't just found a way to survive. She had become part of something that made others whole. Her resilience had become a lifeline. Her words, simple and sincere, had reached into the lives of strangers and awakened courage in the weary. The stories she shared gave language to the unspoken ache so many others carried.
She had built a bridge between pain and healing, between isolation and belonging. And in offering up her journey, she had given others permission to see beauty in their own. What had once felt like a solitary struggle was now a shared anthem of grace, strength, and love that wouldn't let go. That night, she tucked Luca in. He reached for her hand and whispered, "You're the best, Mama." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "You know what? I think I was always meant to be your mama," she whispered. "And showing up, that was the best decision I ever made." And that, she realized, was exactly what love does. She lingered there, brushing the hair from his forehead, watching him breathe. She didn't rush out of the room. She let herself feel the stillness, the wholeness, the quiet miracle of being exactly where she was meant to be. She turned off the light, whispered a prayer of thanks, and stepped into the hallway. There, taped to the door, was a crayon drawing, a stick figure holding hands with a smaller one. Above it, in Luca's blocky letters, were the words, "My Mom." For every night she cried herself to sleep, for every morning she had to fight to keep going, she now saw the quiet thread of grace that had carried her through. It hadn't been just her strength. It had been his comfort in the silence, his guidance in the still, small whisper, his mercy woven into the ordinary. She had grown, not just older, but deeper, wiser, kinder. And as she stood there holding Luca's drawing, she felt it in her bones. Gratitude not only for the ending, but for the refining, for the faith he had built in her along the way. "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days." Ecclesiastes 11:1. Janine didn't set out to be a hero. She just showed up when it mattered most. She gave even when she had almost nothing left. And in the end, love found its way back to her. Not all at once, but slowly, in whispered prayers answered, and quiet mercies multiplied. That's the thing about faithfulness. It doesn't always bring fame, but it brings fruit. And sometimes, when we least expect it, it brings us home.